The gavel fell with a sound like a bone snapping. It was a dry, final crack that echoed across the parched yard, a sound that severed Adeline's life in two. Before, and now, after. She stood motionless, a solitary figure of 25 years adrift in a sea of dusty hats and self-righteous faces. The sun beat down on her calico dress, bleaching the last of its color, just as the bank had bleached the last of the hope from her heart. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose kindness was as thin as his lips, avoided her gaze, his attention fixed on the deed of sale he was signing with a flourish. He had taken everything. The house her husband Daniel had built, the fields he had plowed, the future they had sketched in firelight whispers. All of it was now just paper and ink in the hands of a man who saw land not as a living thing, but as a column in a ledger. The crowd began to disperse, their curiosity sated, their duty as witnesses to a neighbor's ruin fulfilled. They offered no words of comfort, only furtive glances, their pity curdled by a quiet fear that such misfortune might be contagious. Adeline's world had shrunk to the few feet of baked earth on which she stood. She clutched the one thing they had overlooked, the one object deemed too insignificant to list on the foreclosure notice, a heavy, rust-pocked iron key. The key to the barn. It was a cold, cruel piece of charity, allowing her and her mother to remain as tenants in the cavernous outbuilding, caretakers of a property that was no longer their own. The key felt impossibly heavy in her palm, a dead weight of shame and failure. She looked up at the barn's great, weathered face, its wood faded to the color of bone, its hayloft door gaping like a silent mouth. It was no longer a symbol of harvest and promise. It was a tomb, a monument to all she had lost. And as the last wagon rumbled away, leaving her alone with the prairie wind and the long shadows of the afternoon, a despair so profound it felt like drowning pulled her under. She had nothing left. Nothing but an old woman, a cavern of dust and shadows, and a key to a prison of her own past. It had not always been a prison. It had been a cathedral of dreams, built of sweat and ponderosa pine. Daniel, her Daniel, with his wide shoulders and hands that could calm a nervous horse or coax a seedling from the soil, had raised it beam by beam. They had come to this valley with little more than 2 strong mules and a conviction that the earth would provide for those who respected it. They had broken the sod together, their laughter mingling with the screech of the plough blade. The loan from Mr. Abernathy's bank in town had seemed a blessing then, a necessary tool to purchase the seed and livestock that would transform their patch of wilderness into a thriving homestead. Abernathy had smiled, had spoken of community and shared prosperity. His words were the bait, the contract the hook. The first year was a good one. The corn grew tall, and the small herd of cattle fattened on the rich prairie grass. Their small house filled with the scent of baking bread and the sound of Daniel's off-key whistling. Adeline's mother, Martha, had come to live with them after she was widowed herself. A woman of 70, with eyes that held the wisdom of a different, older world, she moved with a quiet purpose, her gnarled hands never still. The townspeople found her unsettling. She spoke little, her accent thick from a homeland of mountains and harsh winters, and her knowledge of herbs and remedies was whispered to be unnatural. But to Adeline, she was a rock, a living link to a lineage of resilient women. Then came the fever. It swept through the valley like a phantom fire, swift and merciless. It took Daniel in 3 short days, leaving Adeline with nothing but a cold bed and a silence that screamed. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. The farm, once a shared joy, became an unbearable burden. That year, the rains failed to come. The corn withered on its stalks, and the creek dwindled to a muddy trickle. The cattle grew thin. The debt to the bank, once a manageable sum, began to swell, growing like a malignant tumor in the pages of Abernathy's ledger. Adeline fought, she toiled until her hands bled, but one woman's grief-stricken labor could not turn a drought. The letters from the bank began to arrive, their language shifting from polite reminders to cold, sharp demands. The smiles from Mr. Abernathy in town were gone, replaced by a look of stern disappointment, as if her failure were a personal affront to his own good judgment. He was no villain, she told herself. He was a businessman. But his business was the methodical dismantling of her life, and he pursued it with the passionless efficiency of a wolf singling out the weakest member of the herd. The final notice was nailed to her door, the paper stark white against the weathered wood, a surrender flag she had no choice but to honor. The auction was set, and the community he had once spoken of so warmly gathered not to help, but to watch, to spectate, to pick over the bones of her broken dream. The first weeks in the barn were a descent into a grey, featureless existence. The vast, empty space mocked them with its scale, a constant reminder of the life that should have filled it. They partitioned a small corner for themselves with old horse blankets, creating a cramped, drafty shelter within the larger shell. The hayloft above was their bedroom, the hard planks their mattress. Every morning, the rising sun would spear through the gaps in the siding, casting long, dusty fingers across their faces, a cruel and beautiful awakening to another day of emptiness. Their diet consisted of what they could forage, bitter roots, a handful of wild berries, and the meager charity of the preacher's wife, who would sometimes leave a small parcel of cornmeal or dried beans at the barn door, her face a mask of strained pity. Hunger became a constant companion, a dull ache in the pit of the stomach that sharpened into a piercing cramp by nightfall. The emotional toll was just as severe. The town that had once been their community now treated them like ghosts. When Adeline walked into town for supplies, a small bag of flour bought with the last of her coins, conversations would cease. People would cross the street to avoid her, their eyes fixed on some distant point. She was a living embodiment of failure, a cautionary tale whispered among the prosperous. Her shame was a physical cloak, heavy and suffocating. Mr. Abernathy, now the legal owner of the land, would ride out once a week to inspect his property. He would peer into the barn, his gaze sweeping over their pathetic living quarters without a flicker of emotion, as if they were just another part of the inventory. He never spoke to them directly, only issuing instructions about mending a fence or clearing a ditch through the new tenant farmer, a grim-faced man who worked the fields that should have been hers. Adeline would watch him from the shadows of the barn, a cold, hard knot of resentment tightening in her chest. Her mother, Martha, endured the hardship with a stoicism that bordered on unnerving. She grew thinner, her face becoming a roadmap of wrinkles and bone, but her eyes never lost their sharp, observant light. She would sit for hours, mending their worn-out clothes with thread unraveled from old sacks, her hands moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to defy their poverty. She rarely spoke of their plight, but Adeline could feel her mother's strength, a quiet, unyielding presence in the suffocating silence. It was a strength Adeline could not yet find in herself. She felt brittle, hollowed out, as if the slightest breeze could shatter her into 1,000 pieces. The future was not a distant horizon of possibility, it was a wall, blank and insurmountable, just a few feet in front of her face. One evening, as a cold autumn wind rattled the barn doors, the two women sat huddled around a small, smoky fire built in a rusty bucket. The flames cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls around them. Adeline was staring into the embers, her mind a numb landscape of despair, when Martha finally spoke, her voice raspy from disuse. "In my country," she began, her gaze fixed not on the fire, but on the hard-packed dirt floor beneath their feet, "the winter is a white wolf that eats the world for 6 months. The wind howls like a hungry spirit, and the snow buries the houses up to their roofs." She paused, letting the image settle in the cavernous silence. Adeline said nothing, accustomed to her mother's strange, poetic pronouncements. On the surface, Martha continued, tapping the earth with a gnarled finger, "everything dies. The trees are skeletons, the rivers are stone. To live on the surface is to be a fool, to offer yourself to the wolf." Adeline looked at her mother, a flicker of curiosity piercing her apathy. "So what did they do?" Martha's eyes met hers, and for the first time in weeks, Adeline saw not just endurance, but a fierce, ancient intelligence. They did not fight the winter. They went under it. They yielded. They dug. The earth beneath the frost is not dead. It is waiting. It is warm. It holds the memory of the sun. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Every family had a cellar, not for roots, but for life. A room beneath the barn, hidden from the tax man and the wolf alike. A place to keep the milk cow, the goats. A place where the warmth of the animals and the breath of the earth could conspire to keep life going until the sun returned. An idea, wild and impossible, began to form in the barren space of Adeline's mind. It was madness. Digging a cavern beneath the barn? With what tools? With what strength? They were two women, one old and frail, the other worn down to a sliver of her former self. It was a fantasy born of hunger and desperation. She started to voice her objections, but Martha held up a hand. The world has taken everything from us on the surface, child. Our name, our land, our pride. There is nothing left for them to take up here. Her gaze swept around the dusty, shadow-filled barn. But they do not own the dirt beneath our feet. They do not own the darkness. We have been cast out. So we will make our own world where no one can see it. The conviction in her mother's voice was absolute. It was not a plea, but a statement of fact. For the first time since Daniel's death, a different kind of feeling began to stir in Adeline's chest. It was not hope, not yet. It was something more primal, more defiant. It was the first, faint flicker of a buried ember, a realization that when you have truly lost everything, you also have nothing left to lose. The madness of the idea was its very appeal. It was an act of rebellion so profound, so secret, that it could belong only to them. They would not flee. They would not surrender. They would dig. The work began not with a grand gesture, but with a single, tentative scrape of a rusted spade against the barn's floor. The sound was small, almost pathetic in the immense silence, but it was the first note in a symphony of defiance. Their tools were meager, one worn shovel with a cracked handle, a small hand trowel, and two splintered buckets. Their first task was to choose a location, a place shielded from the casual view of the main doors. They selected a corner hidden behind a stack of old, rotting feed troughs, a space perpetually cloaked in shadow. Adeline drove the shovel into the compacted earth. It was as hard as stone, a dense mixture of clay and gravel packed down by decades of heavy wagons and livestock. The first shovelful was a pathetic dusting of dirt. Her arms, weakened by grief and poor nutrition, screamed in protest. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced her resolve. But then Martha was beside her, kneeling with a small trowel, her movement slow but surprisingly effective, chipping away at the edges, loosening the soil for Adeline's next attempt. They fell into a rhythm, a silent partnership of brute force and patient precision. The first day, they managed to excavate a hole barely large enough for a coffin. That night, their bodies ached with a pain so deep it felt as if their very bones were bruised. But it was a different kind of pain from the gnawing ache of hunger or the hollow pang of loss. This was the pain of effort, of creation. It was a good pain. The problem of the displaced earth was their first great challenge. They couldn't simply pile it outside, Abernathy or the tenant farmer would see it immediately. Martha's ingenuity provided the solution. Under the cover of darkness, they would fill the buckets and carry the dirt to the far end of the property, scattering it thinly along a dried-up creek bed where it would be washed away by the next rain. It was a slow, back-breaking process, a journey of 100 yards repeated dozens of times each night, their bare feet silent on the cool ground, the stars their only witnesses. As the hole deepened, they faced new dangers. The walls threatened to collapse. They began to scavenge for lumber, prying loose boards from abandoned sheds on the property line, dragging fallen cartonwood logs from the creek bed. They learned the rudiments of structural engineering through trial and error, bracing the earthen walls with a crude but effective latticework of wood. They dug by the dim light of a single lantern, its glow creating a small, subterranean world of flickering shadows and the rhythmic sounds of their labor, the scrape of metal on earth, the grunt of effort, the soft thud of dirt in a bucket. They spoke little, their energy entirely consumed by the task. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The hole became a room, a secret cavern 12 feet wide and 20 feet long, with a ceiling just high enough for Adeline to stand upright. They carved niches into the walls for shelves and dug a shallow trench for drainage. They fashioned a hidden entrance, covering the opening with a heavy wooden pallet and loose hay, a trapdoor to their hidden world. Down in the cool, damp darkness, the air smelled of rich soil and effort. It was a scent of life, of possibility. It was the smell of their sanctuary, a kingdom they had clawed from the unforgiving earth with nothing but their own 2 hands. The acquisition of the cows was a transaction born of finality. Adeline took the last thing of value she possessed, the thin gold wedding band Daniel had placed on her finger, and walked into town. She did not go to the general store or the bank, but to a struggling farmer on the edge of town, a man whose own luck was running thin. He looked at the ring, then at Adeline's desperate, determined face. For that small circle of gold, a symbol of a life that was gone, she received 2 gaunt Jersey cows, their ribs showing and their eyes dull with neglect. Their names were Daisy and Buttercup. Leading them back to the barn under the cloak of twilight felt like smuggling jewels. They were the living, breathing heart of the entire operation, and their discovery would mean ruin. The ramp down into the subterranean stable was steep and narrow, and it took all of their combined strength to coax the nervous animals down into the darkness. But once inside, the space seemed to calm them. It was warm, shielded from the biting wind, and the thick beds of fresh hay they had gathered were an unimagined luxury. The first milking was a sacred ritual. By the lantern's soft glow, Adeline sat on a low stool, the warmth of Daisy's flank seeping into her side. The metallic plink of the first streams of milk hitting the bottom of the pail was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of life, of sustenance, of a future. Martha, drawing on the knowledge of her youth, became the alchemist. She taught Adeline the ancient art of cheesemaking. The process was a delicate dance of temperature and time. They heated the rich, creamy milk in a large copper pot over a carefully shielded fire pit they had built in another corner of the barn. Martha showed Adeline how to test the temperature with her finger, how to add the rennet, a mysterious substance she had made from the stomach of a rabbit, and how to wait with absolute stillness for the milk to set into a quivering, magical curd. "Patience," Martha would whisper, her voice reverent. "The cheese feels your hurry. You must be calm." Adeline learned to cut the curd into small, precise cubes with a long wire, to gently stir it as it released its whey, a pale, watery liquid they would save for themselves to drink. The most crucial part was the pressing. They had constructed a makeshift press from a heavy log and a system of levers. They packed the warm curds into cloth-lined molds and placed them under the weight, squeezing out the last of the whey. After hours of pressing, a pale, fragile wheel of cheese would emerge. They would then salt it, rubbing the coarse grains into every surface, a process that would protect it and give it flavor. The final step was aging. They had built shelves into the earthen walls of their cellar, a perfect environment of consistent coolness and humidity. They placed the first small wheel on a shelf, and it sat there like a promise. They tended to it daily, turning it and wiping it with a brine-soaked cloth. After 3 weeks, Martha declared it ready. She cut a small wedge with a knife. The inside was a pale, creamy yellow. Adeline took a piece, her hand trembling slightly, and put it in her mouth. The flavor was a revelation. It was rich, nutty, and slightly sharp. It was the taste of the sun and the grass, the taste of the warm earth and their own sweat and toil. It was the taste of survival. It was the taste of victory. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of hay and damp earth, with a piece of their first cheese melting on her tongue, Adeline felt a joy so pure and fierce it brought tears to her eyes. Their impossible plan had worked. With their first success bolstering their spirits, the 2 women did not rest. They saw the single wheel of cheese not as a destination, but as the first step on a much longer journey. The looming threat of winter was a powerful motivator, a deadline set by nature itself. Every ache in their muscles, every blister on their hands, was an investment in their future survival. The initial cavern, which had once seemed so vast, now felt merely adequate. They began to expand, not outwards, but deeper, carving out a second, larger chamber connected to the first by a short, narrow tunnel. This new room was to be their larder, a subterranean pantry dedicated entirely to the aging of cheese. The work was relentless. By day, Adeline would take the cows to a secluded pasture hidden in a small canyon, far from the main road and prying eyes, while Martha would work below, slowly and methodically chipping away at the earth. By night, they would work together, hauling out the dirt and reinforcing the new walls. They became connoisseurs of the earth, learning to read its layers, to distinguish between the soft, workable loam and the hard, unyielding clay. Their bodies hardened, their hands calloused, their movements economical and efficient. The cheese-making operation became a daily ritual, as ingrained in their lives as the rising and setting of the sun. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, each woman knowing her role. The milking, the heating, the cutting of the curds, every step was performed with a quiet, focused intensity. They began to experiment, with Martha guiding them. They made harder cheeses for longer storage, pressing them for days until they were as firm as wood. They washed some rinds with brine to encourage the growth of specific molds, creating sharper, more pungent flavors. They even wrapped some small cheeses in leaves they had gathered from the creek bed, imparting a subtle, earthy tang. The shelves in the new cavern began to fill. Row upon row of golden wheels, ranging in size from small discs to large, heavy rounds, lined the earthen walls. The air in the cellar grew thick with the rich, nutty aroma of aging cheese, a scent that was the very perfume of their security. They were building a fortress of food, a secret cache of calories and protein that would see them through the darkest days of winter. As autumn deepened, a sense of urgency settled over the valley. The tenant farmer worked his team of horses from dawn until dusk, bringing in the meager harvest. The townspeople began to stockpile firewood and salt their meat. There were whispers of a hard winter coming, the old-timers reading the signs in the thickness of the squirrels' coats and the early migration of the geese. But their preparations were all on the surface, all visible and vulnerable. Adeline and Martha watched and listened, their own preparations remaining a profound secret. They were no longer just surviving, they were planning, preparing, and building a hidden world of abundance, one shovelful of dirt, one pail of milk, one wheel of cheese at a time. The first snow fell not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, violent onslaught. A leaden sky opened up, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The wind came shrieking down from the north, a physical force that scoured the landscape and drove the snow into mountainous drifts. It was not a storm, it was a siege. For days, it did not relent. The valley, once familiar, was transformed into an alien landscape of undulating white, its features erased, its roads obliterated. The cold was a predator. It was a deep, penetrating cold that found its way through every chink in every wall, that froze the ink in the inkwells and the water in the buckets beside the hearth. The livestock of the valley, sheltered in their surface-level barns and pens, stood no chance. The tenant farmers' cattle were found frozen solid in their stalls, statues of ice and hide. The chickens in their coops, the pigs in their sties, all succumbed to the brutal, unrelenting temperature. The town's food supply, which had seemed so adequate in the mild days of autumn, began to evaporate. The salted meat ran out. The sacks of flour and beans emptied with alarming speed. Panic, a quiet but corrosive force, began to spread through the community. The general store was stripped bare. Faces grew gaunt, and the eyes of children grew large and frightened. The great winter, as it would later be called, had locked its jaws on the valley, and it was not letting go. Mr. Abernathy, the man of ledgers and assets, found that his wealth was meaningless. His money could not buy a side of bacon that did not exist. His deeds and contracts could not be eaten. He was just as cold, and just as hungry, as everyone else. One afternoon, a month into the siege, a small, desperate procession of townspeople made their way through the deep snow to the old farm. They were led by Mr. Abernathy himself, his face grey with cold and humiliation. They came to the barn, the last, desperate hope, to beg for any forgotten scraps of grain or fodder that might be left. They found Adeline and Martha, looking thinner, perhaps, but with a strange, calm light in their eyes. Abernathy, his voice hoarse, made his plea. Adeline listened, her face unreadable. When he was finished, she simply nodded. She did not lead them to the empty grain bins. She did not point to the bare hayloft. Instead, she walked to the corner of the barn, to the pile of rotting troughs and loose hay. With a single, strong pull, she lifted the heavy pallet, revealing a dark, square hole in the floor and a crude ladder leading down. A wave of warm, earthy, living air washed up from the opening. The men stared, confused. Adeline descended the ladder without a word, and after a moment's hesitation, Abernathy and the others followed. What they saw stunned them into silence. In the warm glow of several lanterns, they saw not a root cellar, but a thriving, living world. 2 healthy cows stood contentedly in a clean, dry stall, munching on hay. And beyond them, in the adjoining chamber, were the shelves. They lined every wall, from floor to ceiling, laden with hundreds upon hundreds of wheels of cheese. Golden, amber, and pale cream, they represented a treasure more valuable than gold: food. Abundance. Survival. Abernathy stared, his mouth agape. He, the man who had stripped them of everything on the surface, stood now in a secret kingdom built beneath his very feet, a kingdom of wealth he couldn't comprehend, created by the two women he had cast aside as worthless. The irony was as thick and palpable as the scent of aging cheese that filled the air. The salvation of the town was not given as charity, it was dispensed as a lesson. Adeline, standing in her subterranean larder, was no longer the shamed, broken widow. She was a queen in a kingdom of her own making, and she set the terms. The cheese would be distributed to every family, enough to see them through the winter. But it would not be a gift. It was a debt. A debt not of money, but of principle. When the thaw came, the town would work together to rebuild her farm. The community that had stood by and watched her fall would now be the community that raised her back up. Mr. Abernathy, humbled and defeated, readily agreed. The distribution began that very day. Adeline and Martha worked tirelessly, handing out the heavy wheels of cheese, a tangible currency of survival. The sight of the townspeople, their former tormentors and indifferent spectators, now looking at them with a mixture of awe and profound gratitude, was a quiet, deeply satisfying vindication. The cheese saved them. It was sliced thin and eaten with the last of the bread, melted into watery broths to give them substance, and gnawed on by hungry children, sustaining them through the darkest weeks of the winter. When the spring finally came, melting the snow and revealing a landscape scarred by the winter's fury, the town kept its promise. A work crew, organized by Abernathy himself, arrived at the farm. They repaired the house, mended the fences, and helped plough the fields for the spring planting. It was a communal act of penance and rebirth. Adeline used the leverage she now held, the undeniable debt the town owed her, to reclaim her land. It wasn't a transaction of cash. She traded the remaining surplus of her winter cheese, the very product of the land Abernathy had seized, to buy back the deed. He signed it over without argument, his signature no longer a flourish of power, but a simple, quiet admission of defeat. The underground dairy became a local legend, a testament to the quiet, unyielding power of two forgotten women. Adeline continued to run the farm, her methods a blend of Daniel's practical knowledge and Martha's ancient wisdom. She taught other women in the valley the art of cheesemaking, sharing the knowledge that had been their salvation. Martha lived out her remaining years in peace, sitting on the porch of the restored farmhouse, her work done. She was no longer seen as a strange outcast, but as a matriarch, a wellspring of quiet strength. When she passed, the entire valley mourned. Adeline lived a long and full life. She never remarried, her heart forever belonging to Daniel, but her life was not one of loneliness. It was a life of purpose, of community, of quiet dignity. The farm thrived, and the secret cellar beneath the barn remained, a cool, silent reminder of the winter they had conquered, not by fighting, but by going deeper. And so we come to the end of this story, but not to the end of its meaning. For this is not merely a tale of a widow and her mother, of a cold winter and a secret cellar. It is a parable for the human spirit. It is a testament to a profound and enduring truth, that our greatest strength is often hidden, buried beneath the surface of our lives, waiting to be excavated. We all face our own foreclosures. We all have moments when the world, with its cold and indifferent logic, seems to take everything from us. Our dreams are seized, our plans are broken, and we are left standing in the dust, holding nothing but the key to a place of failure. And in those moments, we feel the temptation to despair, to believe that all is lost because everything on the surface is gone. But the story of Adeline and Martha whispers a different counsel. It asks us to look down. It asks us to consider the ground beneath our feet, not as an endpoint, but as a beginning. It reminds us that beneath the hard-packed earth of our failures and our grief, there is a hidden resource, a deep and untapped reserve of strength, ingenuity, and resilience. What is your barn? What is the structure in your life that seems only to be a monument to what you have lost? And what if, within that very place of pain, there is a hidden flaw, a secret entrance to a part of yourself you have not yet discovered? The world may take your house, your job, your reputation. But it cannot take the earth beneath you. It cannot own your will to dig. The work will be hard. It will require you to toil in the dark, to use crude tools, to fight against collapse and exhaustion. You will have to move mountains of your own doubt and fear, one bucket at a time, under the cover of darkness. But the pain of this effort is the pain of creation. It is the ache of building something new in a place where everyone else sees only emptiness. Find your own secret cellar. Cultivate your own hidden strength. Make your own cheese in the dark. Because the winters of life will come for all of us. And when they do, when the surface world is frozen and barren, you will not only survive, you will have something of substance to offer a hungry and desperate world. You will have a warmth and a wealth that cannot be measured in any ledger. You will have become the source of your own salvation.